Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into something deeply fascinating. Are we actually watching a fundamental changing of the global world order? We're going to break down Ray Dalio's famous changing world order theory. But we aren't just treating this as some abstract historical concept. No, we're putting it to the test, using the hard, unyielding macroeconomic realities of 2026. Because right now, growth is measurably slower basically across the board. Inflation keeps getting pushed around by unpredictable energy shocks, and major global economies are running massive, sustained deficits. So how does this grand theory hold up against the cold, hard data staring us in the face today? Well, to figure that out, we have to look a little deeper.
So here's our roadmap for today. First, decoding the Dalio Cycle. Then, the reserve currency trap. Third, Europe and Canada squeezed. And finally, pattern is not destiny.
You know, when we take a step back and look at global markets, the slowing domestic growth, and just the intense political polarization out there right now, it is incredibly easy to fall into this sensationalized, apocalyptic mindset. But is that actually accurate? Are we literally watching the dramatic collapse of an economic empire? Or are we simply experiencing the totally predictable vulnerabilities of a late-stage economic cycle playing out exactly as it has for centuries? To answer that, let's unpack the mechanics of the cycle itself.
All right, part one, decoding the Dalio cycle, or as I like to call it, the engine of power.
Dalio argues that money, institutions, and geopolitics align in a very specific, predictable sequence. It's like a giant, slow-moving domino effect. Think about the Dutch or British empires. Their rise didn't just happen overnight. It takes decades, sometimes centuries. An empire is built step by step, starting right at the base with a powerful foundation of education. A highly educated populace then feeds directly into cutting-edge productivity and innovation. And that productivity, it fuels immense global trade, generating massive wealth. Trade dominance naturally builds unparalleled financial power, making the nation's markets the world's clearinghouse. And ultimately, that financial dominance supports the ultimate prize, reserve currency status. The real kicker here is that reserve currency status lets a country borrow more cheaply and for longer than anyone else on the planet. But it begs the question, what happens when that forward momentum starts to stall out?
Well, here's the absolutely crucial part. Notice how the crushing weight of debt forces a systemic shift. Dalio isn't just saying history repeats. He's laying out a fundamental macroeconomic principle. When a state can no longer finance its mounting obligations the normal way, say because domestic growth is slowed down and deficits are running persistently high, it essentially shifts that financial burden directly into the currency itself. Central banks step in, they print money to provide relief, and suddenly, the line between a short-term cash rescue, liquidity, and long-term financial survival, solvency, starts to get really blurry. Repeatedly running to the rescue with monetary policy weakens the purchasing power of that money and pushes wealth into real, hard assets. This completely shifts how we need to think about our systemic vulnerabilities in 2026.
Which brings us to part two, the reserve currency trap. Let's look at strength, complacency, and the dollar.
So, when we examine the United States, which currently sits as the core empire in our global system, the sheer, undeniable resilience of the US dollar really stands out. According to the Federal Reserve, the dollar accounted for 58% of disclosed global official reserves in 2024. The euro is sitting far behind at just 20%. So despite all these massive geopolitical shocks and a lot of loud chatter about a post-dollar world, the dollar's share stayed practically untouched between 2022 and 2024. And on top of that, data from the St. Louis Fed shows the dollar was used in an astonishing 89% of foreign exchange transactions heading into 2025. It is absolutely still the undisputed center of global payments. The dominance is clear, right? Network effects are incredibly powerful, but dominance is not the same thing as immunity. Because contrast that incredible global dominance with this staggering number, $1.9 trillion. That is the Congressional Budget Office's projected U.S. federal deficit for fiscal 2026 alone. To put that in perspective, that's equal to 5.8% of the entire American gross domestic product. And this is happening while government spending is already well above its 50-year average. It is a massive, structural gap between the money coming in and the money going out. And honestly, this is exactly why reserve currency status can become a trap. We're going from a $1.9 trillion deficit in 2026, rising sharply to a projected $3.1 trillion by 2036. This perfectly captures the warning buried in Dalio's cycle theory. Having the world's reserve currency gives the U.S. enormous, almost unfair financing advantages. Dollar assets are super liquid, and foreign managers treat them as the ultimate safe haven. But that very success breeds deep, dangerous complacency. It makes long-run fiscal discipline so incredibly easy to just postpone and pass on to future generations. The system actually encourages borrowing because everyone assumes the currency will always be the safest place to save. But when your debt is rising exponentially, growth is slowing, and interest costs are climbing, that underlying pressure is mounting silently in the background.
Let's shift gears to part 3. Europe and Canada squeezed. We're looking at vulnerabilities in a slow growth era.
Stepping back from the overarching empire cycle for a second, let's look at the highly exposed realities facing other advanced economies right now. This slow growth environment is just visually undeniable. The IMF projects global growth for 2026 at 3.1%. Now, compare that global average to Canada and the euro area. The Bank of Canada is projecting just 1.2% growth, and the IMF projects a tiny 1.1% for the euro area. These regions are operating in a deeply constrained, tight environment. They simply don't have the luxury of setting global trends. Instead, external shocks end up dictating their economic realities.
Now, what's really interesting is that those economic squeezes look fundamentally different depending on where you're sitting. Europe is battling a severe internal squeeze. They're dealing with a sustained energy-driven supply shock intimately linked to the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. Higher energy costs heavily pressure manufacturing, they squeeze everyday consumers, and they leave a fragmented fiscal system with practically zero room to maneuver. Canada, on the other hand, they face an external squeeze. They sit squarely inside the larger dollar-based order. The Bank of Canada assumes oil prices will ease from $90 down to $75 by mid-2027. But if US interest rates stay high, or if global trade shocks keep hitting, Canadian growth basically gets suffocated purely because it relies so heavily on the stability of US finance. It really highlights that even without your own massive domestic crisis, simply relying on a fragile global order can suffocate an economy.
Which leads us perfectly into part 4. Pattern is not destiny. Navigating the changing order. Modern geopolitical scholars from places like Oxford and Cambridge actually offer a really crucial counterweight here. They don't treat Dalio Cycle like some rigid, unbreakable law of physics. Instead, they talk about what they call transitional orders. This is that incredibly messy, gray space between one world order and the next. It's characterized by role changes, deeply contested power on the global stage, and just profound uncertainty. Dalio absolutely hits the nail on the head by linking wealth gaps, political polarization, and populism to late-cycle stress. And honestly, he's so persuasive because we are literally seeing all those pressures right now in 2026. But we have to respect the pattern without confusing it for unavoidable destiny. History rhymes, sure, but it isn't deterministic. Empires don't all follow the exact same timetable, and not every single massive fiscal strain inevitably ends in total systemic collapse.
So, how do you survive in a transitional order? It comes down entirely to discipline. First, countries absolutely have to keep inflation anchored. If a population loses faith in its pricing power, the whole foundation cracks. Second, they need to maintain absolute institutional credibility. Think about it. Trust is the actual currency that backs fiat money. Third, they have to invest heavily in real, tangible productivity. We're talking infrastructure, technology, workforce skills, not just relying on financial engineering. And crucially, number 4, they must recognize the hard limits of easy money. We can't pretend forever that debt can infinitely substitute for actual organic economic growth. You just can't rely on the momentum of the past or some inherited structural advantage anymore.
I think this idea perfectly synthesizes our 2026 reading of the changing world order cycle. The overarching message here is not to run for the hills in panic. Having a reserve currency is an incredible economic moat. It protects an economy from so many immediate, acute dangers. But it is absolutely no substitute for true balance sheet strength and rock-solid economic fundamentals. Because if you persistently ignore those fundamentals, eventually that protective moat is going to dry up. Which leaves us with this final, lingering thought to deeply consider as you evaluate your own country, your own investments, and the institutions around you today. Is your economy just coasting on the momentum of past successes, or is it actively building true, sustainable resilience for the transitional order ahead? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the hard questions.